For every dollar of top line that you get, you only get 30 cents on the dollar. For every dollar of procurement improvements that I get a dollar. You can't just sit behind a screen all day and effectively manage this.
If you can make the people you work with look like a superhero, then there won't be as much of an allergic reaction, right?
You have to be transparent. You have to be credible. And I think you have to be respectful. I don't think you can just institute process for the sake of process.
All right, well, welcome to the LightSource podcast. We're here with Chris Chandler. Chris is the founder and managing partner of the Creovia Group, which is a supply chain focused consulting firm that supports some of the biggest companies and biggest private equity firms in the world. So welcome, Chris. I've known Chris for a long time, very good friend, and a huge amount of respect for him and his team. So just excited for the conversation.
Great. Thanks for having me. Great to be here, Spencer.
Cool. So if we hop in, how did you end up in the world of procurement? I know in your experience, you've been doing a lot of roles, and the first real one was, I guess, at General Motors, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, it was. It's funny. I have this conversation pretty often with people because when you run into people that are in procurement, you hear like, I just fell into it. Like it's almost a lot of people don't endeavor to go into procurement for their career when they're young, right?
Yep.
I think I'm a little bit different where I've literally done this my whole life, and I actually went to school for this. So I went to Michigan State, #1 supply chain school in the country, has been for a lot of years. I think we've gone back and forth with Arizona State a few times, and I know like MIT's up there now, and there's a lot that everybody has this. But back when I was in school, back in the dinosaur age, I like to say, I was the third class that came out of that Michigan State program when they first pioneered supply chain management, and everybody else has kind of followed suit since then. Well, we were heavily recruited because it was the late 90s and it was kind of the big thing. And so I fell into this a little bit because I was in the business college. I thought I was going to be in finance. And then I talked to somebody about supply chain who happened to be graduating that semester. And they were telling me about it. And I was like, I got to go check this out. A lot of good job opportunities. It was kind of aligned with my interests. I think it was, good for me because that's kind of the way my mind worked. And it just kind of fit. And so, again, I told people I had a boring career. I went to school for supply chain. I've been in supply chain and procurement my entire career. So yeah, General Motors, 5.5 years out of Michigan State. And then they put me through my business school education. I went to Indiana and ended up going over to Eaton Corporation after that. Spent a few years with a privately held German company before I exited auto, took a complete left turn into CPG, where I worked for Kellogg's. I traded all their corn commodity. I did a bunch of ingredient sourcing. That was interesting. I lived through the 2008 market debacle. That was very, very
right.
And came out of it mostly unscathed. So I must have put some good balls. And then came down here. I moved down to Texas in 2009 to work for Dr. Pepper Snapple. Again, ingredient sourcing for about the first year and a half I was there. Moved over and took on their packaging spend and did all the packaging commodity, save for a couple of categories. And then stood up their indirect practice there, about $2.5 billion worth of indirect spend at the time. And this is before the Keurig acquisition. And now that I see they're now splitting them apart again, which is interesting to me. Moved on to MoneyGram, spent 6 years there, helped led the stand up of the sourcing department there, and then operated it for several years. And then I got into the advisory space, which is where I got into the PE world. And it's been really interesting. I mean, it's a different type of lens than what you get working inside of a corporate function. So for people that, how did I get into this? Again, I was kind of aimed at this anyway, but there's so many different facets of supply chain and procurement, right? Like I started off in pure play supply chain, inventory, logistics. I didn't get into procurement until several years down the line. And then I've kind of stayed there, but within procurement, there's so many different areas.
Right.
I did advanced purchasing at Eaton, and then I went into commodity management when I was, at the German company. I got into agricultural commodities in Kellogg's. I was in MoneyGram. It was all indirects, and it was a lot of technology and a lot of temp labor. So you see so many different sides of the business. People don't often know that about procurement. I think they look at procurement as we're just, paper pushers and we read contracts and we yell at suppliers. Like it's definitely a lot more than that.
Well, I certainly don't think of it as that. But I think that's because we're cut from the same cloth. What do you think's more fun, direct or indirect?
Oh man. I think it depends on your taste and your personality. I probably didn't appreciate direct purchasing until I got into indirects. And what I mean by that is you can drive indirects. It's like you drive a huge amount of impact with not as many irons in the fire, right? So when you're on the indirect side, for for somebody to go, unless you're at a massive company, right? But to
Right.
go save $1 million in indirect, you got to probably run 3 or 4 or 5 different events,
Right.
negotiations. Where in when I was on the direct side, I could go run one RFP and put $5 million on the table.
Oh yeah.
Because you have a massive spend, right? I think the other challenge with indirect too, and this is where you got to have the right mindset for this. You don't own the budget, and you don't own the agenda. You have to really influence the stakeholders in the business for why procurement is here, why we're helping you, how we can make this better for you and make your budget dollars go further. Whereas when I was in commodities and directs, it was like, I set the budget.
Mm.
I had full authority over who the vendors were, who gets approved, who we're awarding business to, obviously in connection with finance, but I didn't have to convince anybody about how we were going to manage that particular area of spend.
It's really interesting, and here's another question maybe on top of that. I mean, do you think if you were to talk to someone who's like really early in career and they want to build I mean, to be honest, I mean, your career in procurement has been an extremely successful one, and I can say that meeting with a lot of different folks across a lot of different companies. Would you recommend to young people in the space that they should start in one or the other, or is it just hey, take any opportunity that's available to you, and what would be like a good what's a good starting ground for people to really like prove themselves and test their metal and get a great education.
It doesn't matter direct or indirect, in my opinion. Right.
Okay.
And I'll give you a great example. When I was in automotive and I moved over to the food and beverage industry, I had somebody actually ask me that question. They were like, well, you've done steel and stampings and, electronics and all this stuff. Like, how are you going to buy ag products? And I was like, look, I understand the supply chain. I understand procurement. I understand the process and the methodology. Learning the commodities is something anybody can do if you put enough time and effort in, right? But to find somebody that really truly understands supply chain broadly
Right.
and procurement and the methodology. So it doesn't matter what commodity you go into, whether it's direct or indirect. I
Right.
think for people just looking to get into procurement, just get into it. Just
Mhm.
and really and work somewhere that has good process, good structure. I think that's what's benefited me is you look at where I
Right.
worked. I didn't go into I had the benefit of working for really large established companies.
Right.
I really got kind of ingrained in this is best practice. Whereas, and I've now taken that, the reason I've been probably successful in the advisory side of the house is
Yeah.
because I can go into smaller mid-market, less mature companies and say, look, this is best practice. This is how the big guys do it. And just because you're a smaller company doesn't mean you shouldn't adhere to this and you shouldn't use this to make your
Right.
business better.
Have there ever been times where those best practices from those sort of iconic larger enterprises haven't been able to be directly patterned onto the sort of mid-market businesses where, I'm just trying to think about examples where maybe it has to be tweaked to work really well.
Yeah, I mean, look, you have to be pragmatic about this stuff is my opinion, right? I don't think you can just institute process for the sake of process. And I think you really and this is where some of the expertise comes in, right? Where like I can walk into a company and say, look,
Yeah.
we can spend all day, I guess for the next 6 months doing spend analysis and building a category plan and doing all of the nits and gnats to get us to here's a contract. Or we can just go and get into the market and do some negotiation and you're still doing proper sourcing, but maybe you don't have some of those
Mm.
more elegant, the upfront stuff. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it, right? But I think you
Yeah.
have to pick and choose where it's appropriate and where it's not. Part of that is coming up in that environment of we had to be that formal and we were required to do those things.
Mm.
I think you start to understand where it added value and where it didn't, so that when you get into situations, say with a smaller company, and you're like, look, we're not going to put you through the paces of all this because it doesn't make any sense and the effort
Yeah.
worth it. But in some things it is. You're going to say, look, for this particular thing, absolutely, we should go through every single step
Right.
in the process. Whereas others, let's just shortcut this and let's get to the right answer.
No, it makes a lot of sense, and I think that that mindset is, to be honest, part of why I tell people that Creovia Group is the best kept secret in private equity value creation because at the end of the day, you're right. Like it's, all the prep and setup is important, but ultimately what you have to get is results. And that's what your team has just been so good at doing.
I think that's spot on, Spencer. I mean, and it's not just me, like the folks that I have behind me that are helping
Yeah.
do some of the stuff in my team, we've been around the block enough times and we
Yes.
kind of know how to make those judgment calls on, okay, where do we really need to go through the full pace, or let's just kind of run the end around on this one and say, we know where to go already. We already have the playbook. Let's just go get to the
Yep.
right answer and start and put some value into the business.
Right. And doing it, look, and time, time matters, right? Doing it 6 months sooner, it completely changes the IRR return equation. If you can just get that EBITDA in the basket now versus, do too much waiting around. So it is interesting. It begs a different question, which is, where do you see some of the differences in, private equity focused procurement versus corporate procurement?
Speed is the biggest thing. I would tell you, working in big companies, and that's not to say big companies don't move fast, but I think at times my experience was there's a lot of constituents involved. You have to make sure that everybody is aware of what's going on. I think it takes a lot of communication, and sometimes there's a lot of red tape. Not to say we don't run into that in the private equity space, but I do think that there's this appetite for how do we just get there faster, right? And I'll tell you, like some of the conversations I have with the private equity partners that I work with are, it's about speed to value and how kind of cut through some of that to just, how do we really, look, investment wise, I think there's been some analysis and studies that have been done across a lot of these PE funds that say when we go into a new investment, the ones that we act immediately on and start extracting value within the first year of the investment are the ones that end up being the most successful. Whereas the ones that may
Mhm.
take at a little slower pace and we kind of, with the value comes over a 2, 3, 4 year horizon, those end up not being as impactful. So I think speed is really the biggest thing.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, and mathematically, that literally just directly changes the x-axis on the return graph. It's like if you just do the same thing you were going to do in 3 months instead of 9 months. I mean, that's
Yeah.
like doubling your outcome. I guess I'm kind of curious. In your experience in the private equity world, what portion of investments that get made, not specifically at the firms you're working with now, but by and large, involve procurement transformation or procurement cost takeout as part of the central investment thesis, right? Because every investor comes in, they say, we're going to buy this company, we're going to build into the valuation we're willing to pay, some acquisitions or some cost takeout or some reorg or some spin-off, or maybe we're just going to pray that the market gets better and then we just chill. Which is never those firms don't last very long. But is procurement, cost optimization, is that like in 100% of things, just at varying levels, or is it that some it's like, no, that's a really big part of the intention coming in, and some it's much less important?
Almost every single invest. So the PE fund that I work for, primarily these days, every single deal that they do, at least the ones that are wholly owned or majority owned, like we're plugged into everyone.
Yep,
It's
great.
on the table, and part of it is because we built this portfolio program, and there's no reason to not take advantage of it. Now, is it the top priority? No, it's not. Right now, on some of them, it is. I would tell you that as of late, the last couple that have come through, it's a key part of the VCP, and there's a lot of levers that we're pulling on to deliver that. But in every deal, no, it's not. I mean, and I think it's
Mhm.
deal by deal. There's some where they're smaller technology firms. Is procurement going to be the biggest piece of this? Like the biggest piece of the value equation for those kind of companies is probably scaling them, building top line
Right.
kind of thing, right? And the procurement side of it is a little more limited. Whereas maybe you get
Hmm.
to a manufacturing company, procurement is a much bigger focus,
Hmm.
because that's what's helping. I mean, there's exponential impact of driving margin improvement by lowering your cost base.
Hmm.
Right? There was always this fight even when I was in the corporate side of things and working for
Yeah.
in corporate procurement, where I used to always make the argument, like, I understand top line is important, and it is. Like, I'm a business person too, right? Top line is important, but for every dollar of top line that you get, you only get 30 cents on the dollar. For every dollar of procurement improvement that I get a dollar,
Yeah.
right? That's kind of the procurement value prop here is a dollar in procurement. So I think, again, I look at it from a different lens because I'm a procurement guy. I think it's true.
100%. And I mean, it's funny because I mean, again, maybe this is also because I'm a procurement guy. For me, it's much more transparent. I can see how we can get a dollar savings to get a new dollar of sales that wasn't there before. That feels like a much harder equation for me personally. And then, by the way, that 30 cents on the dollar, it could be even more extreme than that, right? If you're in a 5% margin business, as you know, it's, you get 5 cents of EBITDA. But um, I'm kind of curious a little bit about, if you were to advise somebody in getting involved in procurement within the PE landscape, right? I think there's sort of maybe three different roles that I tend to see people take. They'll either be like an operating partner at a, at the private equity firm. They'll be an advisor or consultant. You're actually sort of more toward the operating partner side.
Yeah.
And then the third is, the plug and play CPO. I've seen this persona a few times where there will be chief procurement officers. They come in at the beginning of an investment cycle. They do a bunch of cost takeout. They do a bunch of work. 3 years later, the company's, ready for, starting an exit process, and maybe they move on to the next one. And the nice thing about PE is there's so many reps you can get. So if you really prove your value like you have, they just want to keep going back to the ATM, right? So yeah, but what, how do you think about those three different roles, and how would you advise people to, think about getting involved? Or, again, these are only really the top performers in procurement, or frankly, but
Yeah, I think so. If you think about those three different tranches of procurement and PE, I'll say this: the trend over the last, I'm going to say 5 years, maybe even a little bit longer, is almost every private equity group that I have connections with and that I talk to. There's a lot of people that do what I do for other private equity funds, right? And there are some of them who are like in the operating partner role, like I am, or they're full time. There's a lot of funds out there that are hiring a full-time portfolio procurement leader to try to do all this stuff, right? And so, I think there's a pathway there where you can actually be a W-2 inside of a firm leading procurement for their portfolio. I think that's becoming a much more prevalent type of role. But again, to your point, those are probably going to be the most experienced. I mean, you're talking people that have 20, 25 years of industry experience, have probably done a lot of different things, a lot of different commodities, indirects, directs, and they understand just about everything in the procurement space,
right.
because they're going to touch every company, right?
Yeah, they need the breadth.
That's right. And so there's that, right? Now, underneath that, if you have companies, I mean, you think of some of the bigger PE funds, they've got large built out procurement teams. So it's not just one person. You may have some people under. So, I mean, that for somebody,
Blackstone.
if you're younger in your career and you can get into a PE fund like that and really build your experience, I think, that's really, really valuable. But then I'll revert back to, if I think about this, my career path, I wouldn't have had it any other way. I feel like I started at ground level. I learned everything from the ground up. I was walking around on the plant floor. I was in warehouses. I was in manufacturing facilities. I understood the things I was buying. I think that's really important because you cannot, and when I led procurement in a corporate world, I used to tell the people on my team this: you can't just sit behind a screen all day and effectively manage this. You have to get out, talk to your stakeholders, be on the shop floor, understand what you're buying, go to your suppliers' facilities, and kind of get out of the office a little bit. So I think that's really important. And then, obviously the operating partner role, again, is probably these are people that have had long, long careers in procurement and supply chain and have seen just about everything. Like, I think how you get into this. And to your point, once you get in and they kind of give you a shot at it, then it's, you prove your mettle. And if you continue to deliver results, they keep coming back to the well. Because if you deliver results, there's no reason for them not to. Why waste time looking for the next mousetrap? Just use what's working.
I completely agree. I mean, I feel like it's sort of interesting, and this is a very, very nuanced subject, but one, when I've met with other folks who are in private equity ops teams, procurement focused, one of the biggest determining factors of the success of a procurement cost takeout transformation program is actually not their skill, but it's the willingness of the CPOs at the portfolio company to partner. And I think there's a whole spectrum of PE firms from we're very hands off and have no operating support to soft power and influence to we're going to voluntold you exactly what we're going to do because we own the business period. If you don't like it, the next person we replace you with will. So I'm sort of curious about the nuances of working with the portfolio leaders, as an external party, and what do you feel like are the situations that work really well, or the situations that are challenging? How do you solve those things?
Yeah, I mean, I think you heard me talk earlier about directs versus indirects and how
Yep.
on the indirect side, you have to be a bit more of an influencer.
Yep.
You amplify that by a lot when you get into the PE space and you have to deal with CPOs and procurement teams inside of these companies because again, they're running their own show. And so now you're coming now look, that's not to say we walk into a lot of companies and they're like, "Oh my gosh, like
Thank God you're
to
here.
help. This is awesome. Like we didn't know this, or I just need extra hands. This is great. It's so awesome that our PE sponsor is able to provide us these kind of support resources. But you do run into those challenging situations where it feels like they're competing, right? Where you're coming in and saying, I have these solutions to offer you. I'm trying to help you.
Mm,
And they're saying, okay, got it. But I'm going to go over here and do my thing first because I'm going to show you where I can beat you.
okay.
Now, they don't say that, but sometimes it feels like that, right? So you have
Yeah.
to I think the approach is you can't go in and be like, "Hey, I'm Chris. I'm here to show you how to do procurement better." Like, I would never do that.
Yeah.
I think it's much more of an influencer approach. Somebody once told me, they're like, "You have very high EQ."
Yeah.
And, like, I never thought about that, but I guess it's right because I do when I walk into companies, I don't walk in there with, like, armed with a PowerPoint and a laptop
Yeah.
and go, "Hey, here's what you need to do." Um, it's a little bit of that, but it's how you deliver that message, right? And I think
Yeah.
it's more like, "Hey, tell me about what you're doing today. What are your challenges? How can we help you? We have all of these things for you to pick and choose from. You tell us where you think we could be most valuable in helping and supporting you." And I think you get a better response to that.
Mhm.
If you start going in there and saying, "Look, I know I have a better deal here, here, and here, and here," they're gonna immediately people are competitive by nature, especially in
Yeah, of
procurement.
course. Of
They're
course.
immediately gonna go to, "Well, hold on, give me like 5 weeks because now I'm gonna go hurry up and go do a bunch of negotiation on my own and show you where I did better than you." And, I mean, quite frankly, it doesn't and because of the scale of PE, it doesn't happen very often, so now we just wasted 6 weeks. But
Yeah.
I think it's really important for both sides to have the right approach so that you have the right outcome.
Well, I guess this gets to another question, which is, what are the incentives like for the leadership of procurement within portfolio companies? Like, do they have, because sort of one of these things, like, if let's say I have my own perspective and ego, and someone comes in and says, "Hey, I'm going to give you an additional option that you can work with," if I just am like, if I'm just happy go lucky doing my thing, maybe I'll ignore it. But if I'm like,
Yep.
well, the outcome affects my personal compensation, you can put an extra 100K in my pocket because I just don't obstruct you in doing your work,
Yeah.
then heck yes, I'll take you every day and twice on Sunday. So
Yeah.
I guess my question is, I'm a believer that people play by and large to their incentives. I mean, what do you see the incentive structures like for procurement leadership in portfolio companies, and how does that help or harm the collaboration of operating partners?
It's kind of the age-old debate because I remember
Yeah.
years ago we used to talk about this, that salespeople are compensated by commission on what they sell. You
Yep.
you almost nearly never find procurement people that are directly compensated based on what they save. Now we have goals, right? They go into our annual plan and you have to meet your goals to get your bonus and all of these things, but it's not a direct kind of commission structure. And I'm not advocating for that at all, so don't get me wrong. I think you get a lot of procurement people that might look at things differently if that were the case, because again, if I walked in the door and said, "I think I have a better solution for you that can drive X dollars over and above what you're already doing," there would be no debate. They would be like, "Great, show it to me," because they know that every dollar they save, they're gonna get paid on it. That's a whole different ballgame, right? There won't be any debate there because now they're getting to those dollars without any additional effort. If they're not getting compensated on it, then all they really have to rely on is the fact that they can go stand in front of their CFO and say, I had a better deal, right?
Hmm.
And so I think that's part of it. It's part of the hesitation that you run into sometimes is they want to make sure that they're viewed as the procurement expert and that somebody else didn't come in and show them that they can do better,
Yeah.
which is not right. So I'll just tell you my approach on that. The way I get around that is when I walk in the door, the first thing I tell them is like, look, I'm not going to go in front of your CFO and say, look at all the great things that I did for your procurement team. You're going
Yep.
to go in front of your CFO, and the messaging should be, hey, our PE sponsor brought us all of these opportunities and all of these solutions that were pre-vetted. And I'm so smart, I didn't waste any of our internal resources or any of my time. I just took them and I just delivered you X millions of dollars in savings, and it didn't really cost us anyways.
Yep.
Right? Like that to me shows
Right.
procurement leadership because you took the opportunities that were offered to you and quickly acted on them, and you didn't expend any internal resources to do it. Like that seems to make more sense to me.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense, and I mean, look, that's wins all around, right? I mean, at some level, everyone here is on the same team, right? You want to get the best outcome for the company. The procurement leader wants to get the best outcome for the company. The investor wants to get the best outcome for the company, and if you can say, hey, look, what's that old? There's that old quote that's like, it's amazing what you can accomplish if you're willing to forego credit. I think that might have been like Truman or something.
Yes.
And so if you can make the people you work with look like a superhero,
You got it.
then there won't be as much of an allergic reaction, right? And it's funny, I see the same thing on the tech side, just a slight tweak where we have to it's sort of different. We tell people, hey, it's not your fault. You just didn't have the best technology before. And so if you start to see better results, hey, it's not that you were asleep at the wheel.
Right.
It's that you can't, a chef can't cook without an oven, right? It's like a software engineer can't, they can code really badly on pen and paper, but once you start giving people the right technologies and tools, they can start to get better outcomes. So it's not an indictment of your previous work. It's just, finally you're finally, you've been under enabled. Now you're fully enabled, and look at the difference of the wind beneath your, behind your sails. So, I'm kind of curious, like, how often when you're coming into a company, are you doing something where you're touching the tech versus not? And, one sort of interesting difference that I see also between private equity and corporate world is that corporate world, I find a lot more of these kind of like long lead transformations. Like, we're going to implement a new ERP, we're going to implement a new P2P, and this is a 3-year project, plus or minus 2 years. And in private equity, actually, the pitch has to be very flipped, which is, hey, we want to implement a tool that's lightweight, that we can get something done in the next 2 quarters, and then anything beyond that, like, let's not focus on. How do you see the tech world interplaying with the work that you're doing with portfolio companies?
I think it's at the forefront these days, especially with
Okay.
the AI revolution. Probably the number one conversation that we have is the technology portion of this. And I'll tell you, and I've held this opinion for a long time. We go into a company and they say, okay, where can you go save us money? And we come up with a roadmap, and it
Yep.
shows you where that's going to happen. But the one thing I always caveat it with is, in parallel with all of this cost out activity that we're going to do, we have to address process and policy. And within that is technology, right? Because what happens is we can go out and source everything in the company and come up with really great agreements and show you on paper where they're
Yep.
save you money. But if you don't have good process and good policy and good technology to drive people to those agreements and force them to use them, you're never going to realize the savings, because now you
Right.
people buying from wherever they want to buy from.
Yeah.
So I think the technology question is always at the forefront of this, and it's always about how do you get people, for lack of a better way to say it, like how do you get them off of email and spreadsheets and get them actually using tools that guide the process, that automate some of this, manual activity, and really just make it seamless so that people can think about working on their jobs instead of
Mhm.
wrestling with a process, right? It's got to be
Mm.
efficient. And so, I would say, I think you're right on the ERP thing. I do think sometimes companies will overbake it, and they'll make it more
Mm.
complicated than it used to be. But it depends on the company, right? Like I can give you an example of one here just recently where we spent 4 months just negotiating for an ERP deal with them. And it was a lot back and forth with two of the, I won't tell you who they were, but they were two of the
Sure.
large ERP providers that we narrowed down to. And the company said, these are the two we think we want to go with. We didn't just pick one for obvious reasons, negotiation wise, competitive.
Of course, yeah.
Right. But at the end of the day, we picked one, and now it's probably a 2-year roadmap. But we also have to remember these guys are in a lot of different countries. They're coming off of multiple different systems in a lot of business units.
Yeah.
Those kind of things, there's so many tentacles to it that you can't get that done in 9 months. Whereas another company, no real ERP, one business unit, US based. Yeah, we can put that thing in 6 to 8 months. Like,
Yeah, it's a good point. It's a very good point. It is interesting, and I wonder if any of the, strategic buyers of portfolio companies at end of life would like think about the ERP, upgrade as being like valuable. Because I'm just imagining like if someone was selling me an iPhone and they said, by the way, we just upgraded to iOS 11, I'd be like, oh, sweet. So I can use the tool a little bit better. If somebody comes in and says, hey, we just upgraded our ERP and the whole business is humming well, I feel like that is an operational advantage. I certainly see it in one circumstance, very pointedly. I'm thinking about one of our customers that's in the aerospace and defense arena, where the ERP implementation is actually not just operational, but the value that they're seeing is that they think that it will be helpful for IPO readiness. Like if we can get an ERP that's a clean instance, very easy to audit our financial trails and stuff like that, our ledger, then we can go to filing with much more confidence than if we had a scattershot system. So there might be some values there, and you're right. Maybe 2 years is actually a reasonable amount of time, depending on the level of complexity.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a very good point.
Yeah. And look, to your point, the whole IPO readiness thing, when you think about private equity in particular, you invest in a company that is maybe immature at the time, it's growing,
Yep.
scaling rapidly. You have companies that come in and they're operating their $100 million companies, and they want to scale to $1 billion in the next 2 to 3 years. If you don't address the technology and the process and the policy when they're still a $100 million company, trying to move it's the old adage of trying to turn a freighter around.
Yeah.
The bigger the boat, the longer it takes to turn the boat, right? And so you can be more agile and decisive when you're a $100 million company versus I've gotten to $1 billion. I'm going to break a lot of things when I now try to adjust and do so. I'm always a big proponent of that, which is, think about this stuff when you're still small. The rawer you get, because some people go, I don't need to think about that until I'm bigger. Once you're bigger, it's a lot harder to do. You have a lot more things to untangle.
It's true. Well, last question about the private equity space that I was just sort of thinking about. You'd mentioned, some of the work related to Indirect involved, and I'm just going back one thread, is involved in like finding the agreements that are already in place and helping make sure that people are compliant to those agreements. And that's the sort of, we found this great price. Let's now make sure that people are doing it. How do you think about going in and, helping people do indirect sourcing better versus just saying, hey, we're going to outsource our price list to a GPO and just say, hey, look, here's an agreement that is available to you. That's not just all of our portfolio companies, but all of ours and many other people's portfolio companies. What do you think about the GPO play for, the tail of Indirect?
I would tell you that the GPO relationship is extremely important.
Yeah.
We have many of them. We use them quite often.
Yep.
But I don't think it's an all or nothing, right? And what I mean by that is I would not suggest anybody picks up their entire spend set and goes, here, GPO partner, go do all this for me.
Yeah.
I also would tell you that if you're doing it the right way, you've done some investigation on which GPOs in the market are best of breed in specific categories, because while they all have a broad range of category offerings, they don't always all have the best deal in every category. And that's kind of how we've thought about it, how we structured it in this playbooks that I talk about is we know which GPOs have proven to be most competitive in each specific category. And then we also know which categories we know that we can be more competitive in outside of a GPO. This is when you start talking about procurement strategy and category strategy and things like that. You kind of have to know where to go and who the players are. And it's not, and again, I'm not knocking GPOs because they're very
Of
good
course,
partners
of
for
course.
us. We have very close relationships. We use them a lot, and we couldn't do a lot of this without them. But I do think that we're very prescriptive in where we use GPOs and where we don't, because that's how we're maximizing the value and maximizing the cost takeout.
Yeah, for sure. And I definitely don't think you're knocking GPOs. In fact, you're saying very nice things about them. So I don't, no need for the caveat. But I think it makes a ton of sense. Okay, so transitioning a little bit, and I would call this sort of a last question. You know, where do you see procurement showing up in your day-to-day life, outside of the professional world? You're negotiating for your next car lease.
You hit it on the head, Spencer. If I had $5 for every time somebody asked me to go with them to buy their next car, I wouldn't even need to do this anymore. Um, Joking, but no, I mean, really, it shows up. It shows up everywhere. I mean, I think if you just think about everyday life. I mean, something as simple as like you paid somebody to do a service at your house and they didn't do a great job. Well, what is that? That's procurement. What happens when we go contract with a vendor to deliver a good, right? And it comes in and it's defective. Well, I have to call them as procurement and say, hey, this was a defective quality product and we have to work out, right? Or there's some contractually binding terms. I'm sure people like service providers that come to my house probably hate me because I'm like I have to read the terms and conditions and like mark the. I've physically done this. I had somebody put a roof on my house once, and I marked up their terms and conditions, and they were like, "Nobody has ever done this to us before." And I'm like,
Yeah,
"Sorry." Right. So it
yeah,
does. I mean, I think there's a lot of applicability in everyday life. And I try to teach, I have two teenage boys and I try to instill that in them too, which is, you know, the worst somebody can tell you is no. So why wouldn't you ask? I mean,
right.
procurement, you're negotiating. You're not being a jerk about it, but you're just asking and you're being polite about it. And you're saying, well, I feel like there's something better to be had here. And so we should talk about it.
Yeah, it makes a ton of sense. I agree with you 100%. And I think that it's okay to have those expectations as long as you set them up front and you say, "Hey, look, here's my performance expectations." And procurement people are often, I think, there is obviously it's like, one bad apple spoil the lot. People think, oh, my job is to just, basically do a prisoner negotiation.
Yeah.
But a lot of times I've seen procurement folks will have the good ones will have a very savvy perspective. They'll say, they try to understand, hey, what matters to you? What matters to me? What matters to you is your time and not being out materials. What if I'm willing to pay whatever the material cost ends up being, but I just need a guarantee that the roof will work, and you know what? Instead of $40, I'll pay $45, but I need you to be willing to come back as many times as you need to get it right, or I need some kind of, I don't know, it depends on the outcome, but there's often like this sort of pattern matching of, what does the vendor really care about, and how can I satisfy their needs, and what are we really getting out of this, and what do we care about, and sometimes finding that sort of slightly off the chart thing,
I completely agree with you. And I think it's something I'm very passionate about is this whole idea of like supplier management, how to negotiate, right? I think a lot of people in the procurement profession sometimes miss on this and it's not their fault. I think because we've been given the reputation of when somebody in the business needs something, we're the heavy, so to speak.
Yeah.
Come in and we're going to beat the supplier up. I don't operate that way, right? And I'll tell you, I learned very early on in my career the pitfalls of that type of approach, and that's probably why I don't subscribe to it. Right? And you
Right.
came up in the same industry to some extent, right? So
Yeah.
you probably know what I'm referring to. And I am a big proponent of and I'll tell you, and I won't go into specifics, but probably the best deal I ever put together in my career, and it still stands. It was in the CPG industry, and I had a really good relationship with my vendor rep, and it was one of the biggest deals in the company. And I literally said, "Look, I need you to come to the office and we're going to spend a half a day and we're going to hash this out. And it was a big deal. And we
Yeah.
sat in a room for about 3 or 4 hours, and the conversation was open and transparent, which some people would look at me and be like, why would you tell them all of that? And I said, because I got reciprocity from him. And I said, I'm going to tell you exactly what I need, and I need you to tell me exactly what you need. And at the end of this,
Yeah.
we're going to get a deal, right? And that's exactly what happened. That contract, I know this for a fact because I know people that know for a fact that
Yeah.
contract still stands today. And it's probably at this point approaching 17 or 18 years
Wow.
that is still there.
Amazing.
It's been renewed like 4 or 5
Amazing.
times. It's crazy, right? But when you put
Yeah.
together that good of a deal and you have that good of a partnership, why wouldn't you? Right?
Right. No, I mean, look, I agree with you 100%. I had a situation recently that is causing me some real anxiety, which is that I negotiated too good of a deal on an office for our new HQ, and we signed an LOI, and then the landlord backed out because they were just like, this doesn't, it actually isn't too good. It doesn't really work for us, And then it was hard to get them back to the table. And a lot of times, I feel, but it's this is the thing I think that's very challenging is that like you're right. Like sometimes you just call somebody up and you're like, hey, look, I just want to understand without just going back and forth on email. I want to understand like what matters to you and what do you need to get to here, and you can hear it in their voice. There's a lot of like subtlety, right? To be able to see like if they're really like, look, trust me, like I'm not going to be able to get them to agree to that. Or like, well, maybe I could get that if you guys could do something. And then you can find that like sort of narrow path that really works for everyone. But how do you teach that? Because some people like I feel like some people genetically have it and some people do not. And that's the question is like that's where I think process and technology come into place to be like, all right, there's going to be a whole spectrum of people's capability on the negotiating front. Let's just like clip both ends of the spectrum and just bring everyone to the mean, which is if you get 3 bids, you run this analysis, you do this 3 rounds of negotiation, you make an award. That process like loosely approximates, what a really talented negotiator can do.
I know. I mean, I think you're right. I agree with all of that. For me, what it boils down to is when you're negotiating anything, and I don't care if it's you're negotiating something in your personal life. I stand by this.
Yep.
I said I'm passionate about this because I think it elicits the best outcomes. You have to be transparent. You have to be credible, and I think you have to be respectful.
Mm.
Those for me are like, and be direct. Most people think that negotiation is holding your cards close to the vest and trying to make the other side. No, like there's some of that, right? Like I would tell you, like a lot of years ago, there was people I dealt with that I was like, I could go into the meeting and I would just say a few things and I would just shut right up because they were just going to spill.
Yeah.
They would support whatever position I needed because they gave up too much, right? But that's not to say that when I go into a negotiation, I'm not holding things back. If I feel like I'm getting that reciprocity and I'm getting that transparency from the other side, then you should give it back to them because that's how you get to a deal faster. It's how you get to a good deal faster. It's not because you're giving things up. And what goes along with that is I have a template that I use to this day. I've used it for years. It's a template, it's a negotiation strategy template. And a big component of it is what does the other side want? You have to understand that. I think most people go into a negotiation, if you ask them and say, how do you prep for negotiation? Well, I line out all the things I have to get, all the things I have to get. What you're missing is what do they have to get? You need to understand that. And you can either understand it 2 ways. You either know it or think you know it, and you can make some assumptions about what they want, or you can ask them, right? I mean, you said it earlier, open up a negotiation and say, just tell me what you need out of this. Where do you need to get to?
Right.
And understand their side of it, because now what you want is likely very different than what they want, right? And so now you're horse trading and you're saying, well, look, this doesn't matter to you, so just give it to me. And I don't really care about this over here, so I'll give that to you. And then you kind of boiled it down to this is the last 1 or 2 things that we have to agree on. So now we have to find a middle ground.
Right, right. It's true. But again, this is the challenge I struggle with is like I don't know if everybody can do this. You know what I mean? Like I don't know if I mean maybe the framework that you're describing will allow people to do that prep work and figure stuff out, but also, not everybody has that mindset. I don't know, it's this is something I have to think about. Like, can some like, is it nature versus nurture, or is it a little bit of
Yeah.
both? Like, you have to take someone who has got good physicality and then teach them to be an athlete, or is it like, hey, anyone can be taught to do this really well? And there's a lot of judgment. Like, every little sentence is judgment. Do I
Yes.
think that this is going to make them trust me in a real way?
Yeah.
Uh, and also cultural. Like, I feel like, not to say that the people are different, but I feel like if there's someone that I can kind of understand who they are, what they're kinda like, I'm
Yep.
like, "Okay, we can have a real conversation, we can figure it out."
Yep.
If someone's really different from me, it's sort of a little bit more difficult to know, like, is the norm going to be that I give something up and then they're gonna be like, "Ha!" I'm gonna
Right.
keep
Yeah.
and like, "Okay, well, fine."
That's human nature, right? I think if
Yeah.
you get something from somebody, you're like, well, let's see how far I can push them. Right.
Yeah.
And that is part of negotiation. I mean, look, I'll tell you, I do that, but you also do it, or at least I do it with in the end in mind, which is let's see how far we can push it, but also knowing that I'm gonna have to give something up and I'm willing to do that,
Right.
right. And
Right.
it's a give and a take. It's a
Yeah.
chain process. And so the nature versus nurture question, I think it's a little bit of both.
Yeah.
There's some people that maybe are not gonna get there because they just don't maybe they don't have that capacity. But I do think, I mean, I'll tell you my negotiation philosophy and my negotiation uh, expertise has changed a lot over the years. When I was younger, in my younger years, I probably subscribed to the whole, I'm going to walk in the door because I work for big companies. I'm going to walk in the door and I'm going to pound them over the head and tell them, you better give me what I want because I'm whoever, right? I'm the big company. Um, and we thought we could play that card, but even if I could go back and do it all over again, knowing then what I know now, I probably would have had a different approach.
Right, of course. Everybody would. I mean, no one's perfect. You do the best you can at the time. My last question for real though,
Yeah.
Chris. What's the weirdest thing you ever had to source?
Huh. Well, we all remember the COVID days.
Yeah.
I became like the mask and hand sanitizer czar for like a year and a half.
Okay.
Joke. Like I'd never sourced it in my life. I didn't know the first
Yeah.
about it, but as it happens, I had some personal connections with people that were rooted in manufacturing of some of those things, and I had everybody and their brother calling me about, I heard you're the hand sanitizer guy. Like, yeah, I got it. And I was literally delivering like truckloads of hand sanitizer to people because you couldn't get it. And I had a line on a company that at the time had FDA approval for a, a formula variance that none of the other bigger companies had. And so yeah, they tell you that your network is the most important thing in your career. It absolutely is because the networking is what, I had people calling me like, I heard you have a guy. And I'm like, yeah, I got
Yeah.
a guy. He'll help you out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Well, Chris, thank you so much for being on the podcast. This is, like all of our conversations, this has been extremely fun for me and so informative. And you've left me and our audience with a lot to chew on. I'm glad we actually captured this.
Well, it was great. This was really fun, Spencer. I always enjoy talking to you. Great questions, great topics. Really enjoy it.